Hello, my name's Ajay and you're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Today, our guest is Professor Ian Hall, who was once described as a man for all seasons. He's the president of the Bloomsbury International Society, which promotes racial harmony through the arts. He's also the inaugural ambassador for WANGO, the World Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, and the Cultural Commissioner for Rights and Humanity. He was also the first black person to study music at Oxford and, as a result, became the conductor of the Commonwealth Chamber Choir and Orchestra. Last but not least, he's an ambassador for peace. Professor Ian Hall, thank you so much for joining us.
Splendid to be here. It really is terrific to share a moment with you.
Well, today's topic is something you're very familiar with, the challenges to racial harmony in the UK especially. Before we get into that, can you please share with us a defining moment from your life?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. There are several, of course, but I came to the conclusion that a moment which I shall always remember, and indeed cherish in a way, occurred when I was a very little boy, aged 7 or so. My grandmother sent me with a note to take to my godmother, and going through a posh part of Georgetown, British Guiana, where I was born, I passed a large house, very posh and all that, and two little boys, white boys, about my age actually, busy playing with each other, throwing a ball, tossing to each other. And one of them missed the catch. He ran to the railings to retrieve the ball and saw my black face there peering through, admiring and wishing I was part of it. And when he saw me, he immediately said, "You effing black so-and-so, get out of there." So, and I thought to myself, and I still think, now what had got into the mind that little chap to come up with such abusive and destructive language, really? And I've thought about it ever since, because it seems to me that if I could crack that particular nut, I would have a way of knowing what it is that promotes this virulent effect that has people hating in the way they do on the grounds of race, religion, colour, whatever. So that is a defining moment, I think, and it has informed much of the work that I've done in the past years, certainly in trying to advance racial harmony through the arts. Does that make sense as a defining moment?
Yes, it was perhaps a negative moment, but you turned it into a positive, at least in the direction of what you've then gone on to do.
Yes, indeed. I felt very strongly then, even though I was very little really, that this boy was probably encouraging that behaviour by his parents or perhaps the adults around him, really. It was a colonial situation in 1947 in British Guiana, and the whites thought themselves being very superior and so on. And one way of advancing this situation of superiority was, in fact, to push everyone else down, really, and humiliate them and make them feel inferior, which is, I think, a human trait which is expressed not only by white people but all people. Some people, of course, confront it and try to improve themselves and their attitudes one to the other, but others maintain that until they're dying there.
Now, for my generation, growing up in multicultural Britain, you would like to think that racism itself is something that we've already been able to deal with, that it's no longer an issue. But that's not true. So why is it that we're still struggling with trying to create racial harmony?
Well, a number of factors, Ajay. I think in the first place, I think we live in a very competitive society. I mean, I remember from my time studying zoology, school for A level, Darwinism and all the rest of it, really, and survival of the fittest. I think there is this inner motor in all of us which strives to survive at the expense of others. Darwin told us we're in a state of competition one with the other for, food and everything else. And I think that we involuntarily maintain this particular desire to advance ourselves by pushing others down. Now, what you said is perfectly true. You would have thought that certainly since war and an increase in the sort of multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic society, we would have dealt with it. But I don't think we've really actually confronted it in a proper sort of way. Various attempts have been made, of course, through the political machinery and through voluntary organizations to advance racial harmony. But the bulk of the population hasn't been touched by these devices, in my view. Vis-a-vis, most recently, we've been talking about helping Africa. Well, it seems a noble ideal in a way. But people don't really know anything about Africa. They don't empathize. They are ignorant largely. And thus we advance ourselves in an attitude of ignorance and fear, which is a byproduct of ignorance, really. We think that, this black person, in the minds of white people now, this black man is going to pinch jobs or houses or women or whatever. We have these atavistic fears which are very difficult to erase, even with the application of acute intelligence, really.
So are you of the opinion, do you think, that racism is like a genetic disease?
In a sense, I mean, obviously, I speak without authority. I'm not a geneticist, indeed a biological man. But I think in the minds of most people, there is this constant fear, this constant desire to, as it were, push the other down. I think back, so I spent many years in the University of London as director of music and so forth. And indeed, the Bloomsbury International Society was born in the University of London, hence Bloomsbury. I had the experience of having befriended the president of the Students' Union of the School of Orient African Studies. This is in the 70s now, 1978. I was delighted one day when he said to me, in a new intake of students, we've got quite a few black people from Britain. I mean, there are obviously people coming from Africa or something, or India to study. But we had very few homegrown, sort of non-white people. I mean, the University of London, when I was first appointed in '66, was practically all white, would you believe? Anyway, when he said this to me 20 years later, or 10 years later, sorry, that there are one or two British blacks who are there, and they're going to form a society to deal with this problem, to Afro-Caribbean society they're going to form. So I said, how splendid. I said, well, I'm meeting the leader of it at some such a time. Would you care to come along if you're free? I said, I'd be delighted to, really, and encourage this initiative. Now, we all met up, all three. And, I've never been so embarrassed. The black chap, far from being pleasant and keen to befriend and so on and so forth, was most aggressive, almost to the point of being abusive, to the white president of the SOAS Students' Union. I was so embarrassed that I pretended to relieve myself and withdrew, thinking, my God, how absolutely awful. But he, the black chap, wasn't a victim of prejudice, because the white chap was very keen to befriend him and to include and so on and so forth. But he'd come to that meeting with a great deal of fear, I think, which was transmitted as a form of anger and aggression. Attack is the best form of defense. And I think that goes through the minds of many, many people in this country, and indeed in other countries, really, this atavistic fear, this atavistic need to be aggressive, this atavistic need to attack, as a form of defense, as you would have seen it, I suppose. Does that make sense, you think?
Yes, I think there's certainly this aspect of, like you said at the beginning, competition, and having to, in a sense, find yourself superior to somebody else, whether that person is the same colour as you or not.
Mm.
But let's move on. Let's look at what I would like to describe as perhaps the connection between nationalism and racism. Now, I'll give you an example. Last year was, of course, the World Cup, and I found myself just waiting at a bus stop, and a bunch of teenagers came along, and they were a little bit drunk, but they had the flag, and they were cheering for, of course, our team, the England team. And when they saw me, the first thing that they said, in a kind of song and dance way, was, "There ain't no black in the Union Jack." And I didn't react to it, because obviously they were a little bit drunk, but inside I was turning over, because I was just thinking to myself, well, hang on a second, half the football team itself is black.
Yeah,
and you're standing there in my face saying, there ain't no black in the Union Jack.
Yeah.
So what do you think, I mean, in this issue of like nationalism and racism?
Well, I take this example perfectly well, but not surprised to hear it, because there's a paradox here. And the paradox is that although we are confronted, or indeed we belong to a nation of many peoples and so on, yet these boys, these youth, as you say, they hadn't taken it on board psychologically. They didn't really appreciate the fact that now we've moved on. Now, you say, now why is that? First of all, homes, I think, they come from, many of these people, aren't really educated to believe that we should belong to and be totally integrated in a society which is harmonious and honourable. At school, the same thing is so. I think, particularly in London, you and I are Londoners, there is a tremendous phenomenon which manifests itself in that many of these inner city comprehensive schools are all black, or nearly all black, or, you know, I believe one of our mutual friends with her daughters, she's got a daughter at school in Croydon, where there's one white person in her class. Her daughter's the only white in the class. Now, if we, unless or until we do something about all this will continue, you know, because people don't take on board, do they, the need to really appreciate other cultures and other peoples in a totally non-judgmental, empathetic way. This is all an aspect of education, and I'm afraid our education at the moment is lacking in its task of trying to educate people into the right sort of way. This is sad, and it's manifested itself more recently with all the muggings and the shootings and the murders that are going on. And you see, my point is proven by the fact that it's not all black against white. It's often black on black violence. You know,
well, that's actually what I want to get onto, is that aspect, because of course recently in London we've had a spate of black on black gun crime. People have been killed over the last few days, and it's been described as a black on black gun crime or black on black violence. But as you said, we can quite easily kind of use the same expression to look at racism, because black on black, in other words, anyone who's not white or in that ethnic melting pot, often we find there is very much a case of racism for and against people who are actually themselves black, brown, or whatever they may be.
Indeed, really. It is of a great deal of social malaise, disease almost, really, which also manifests itself and contributes to this particular problem, in the sense that many of the younger people, the youth, so-called youth, are themselves not totally integrated in themselves, and I wouldn't say a psychiatric disorder, but there's a certain imbalance really in their thinking and in their minds really. There's no desire or no encouragement to rise up above their circumstances. The opposite, in fact. They're pulled down all the time by their peers, and this leads to disaffection, a disgruntled attitude really, and of course these are all stoking the flames of prejudice and racism, as we call it, I would say. nothing else to add to that except the remedy lies very much in the hands of parents. I think the leader of the opposition here, Mr. Cameron, recently has been coming out with certain suggestions, and so I hope they're taken seriously. Schools also need looking at, the nature of... For instance, when I was a schoolboy, the school song, Archbishop Tennyson's School, where I was the only black person that had gone there since the school was founded in 1685 by Dr. Tennyson in the crypt of St. Martin in the Fields. And the wonderful, where'er you may wander, bear in mind the principles which you were taught, and to do always for God, King and country, our home and our school. I mean, it almost sounds archaic and laughable now, because no one takes that sort of thing seriously. For God, King and country, Queen and country, our home and our school. These pillars of society have been largely eroded, if not actually knocked down in many cases. And this all leads to disaffection, disgruntled behavior. We already have this Darwinistic thing, we're in a state of competition with each other, sort of thing, really. Now there's this dysfunction in society, which of course makes matters worse.
Well, let's look at that aspect of education a little bit closer, because often we're seeing that even black youth in particular at school are not performing as well as, let's say, the Indians or other ethnic communities. And I want to ask your opinion. Do you think there is a racism in educational institutions?
Well, I think there is. I mean, I'm choosing my words very carefully. I don't want it to be said that Professor thinks education is racist. That would be unfair. But I do think that one of the sad things, manifestations, I've just touched on it, of our day, many of the inner city comps, in whether London or Manchester, these big cities, the whites seem to have departed. I often wonder where they go to, because we can't all afford private education, I would have thought. But they're largely all black. Now where I live in Westminster City, which in my day, in the 50s, was a very good school, and I know it only too well because they're one of our rival schools. We used to play with cricket and football. Now I see people pouring out of there in a surly, aggressive, horrible manner, ugly looking, congregating, and all black, This can't be good for society. I don't know how we can cure that. It'd be interesting to see if the Secretary of State for Education has any views on that. But seems to me, if that persists, things will go from bad to worse, really, because the blacks know that if the school was any good, they wouldn't be there in such numbers. More whites would be going. So they assume, therefore, that the school and the teachers are useless, really, or prejudiced or against them or whatever. And they therefore play up and become truculent and obstreperous and difficult,
So they choose to go to, or they're sent to these
They're sent to
bad
but I think there's no choice, really, because they don't, I mean, obviously, sadly, we're getting on to socio-political issues now, but I think the blacks still are at the bottom of the pile in our society, en masse. I mean, there's the odd professional, my father, a dental surgeon, and so on and so forth. But by and large, what is happening is that most black people are confined to the ghettos and to poor conditions and living in what they call underclass situations, really. Now, after the war, when people came here on the Windrush ship, 1948, although a lot of them are crude and backward and from rural areas, working class people to be kind, they still cherish the ideal of perhaps their children becoming doctors or lawyers, which is the normal thing for black people. It's respectability.
Yes.
and a few quid in the pocket to show off and impress neighbours.
And a Mercedes-Benz.
Mercedes-Benz and all that sort of business, really.
Yes.
Well, it has, for most of them, it hasn't happened. And now 5 generations on, 4 or 5, the current black youth, they just don't accept or believe that they can get anywhere. They're consigned to this ghastly settlement and react with knives and guns and this, that, and the other, and creating mayhem, drugs and so forth, you know, because in their particular backward sort of ghetto scenario, the only thing that gains a bit of respect or admiration is your outlaw behavior. And, you know, you could beat up people or steal or do this, that, the other, and so on. So we've got a real socio-political problem. Has to be solved will depend, I think, very, first of all, on people facing the truth, which we don't politically. As I said, Mr. Cameron made some suggestions, and of course, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, and his cabinet, they're always coming up with this, that, the other. I heard one minister say, "Oh, we spent too many thousands on young people, but it's mostly the under 5s, you know." They've got not to spend money, but they've got to find the individuals, the cohesive people who can help to elevate this class and to integrate this class of person into the mainstream of society through achievement, through endeavour and so on. At the moment we haven't begun, really. The whole thing is a shambles. I'm not surprised at what happened recently with the gun people shooting down that sort of. In my view, not to be pessimistic, but to be realistic, it's going to go from bad to worse, you know, until we wake up one day and find that we have a complete anarchy and disorder in our society.
So that's the only time when you think people are going to wake up, is when it just
I think when
descends into complete chaos.
Abject chaos. And we're talking about building more jails now and so forth. But that's not the answer, you see. I mean, after building those next 2 jails, we have to build some more after that, because, you know, this class will is on the move, on the increase, really. You know, I see it sometimes when they interview some of these black people, young people. They're totally inarticulate and sort of, you know, odious, really. You know, they invent a sort of way of speaking which is ghastly and extreme, really, and clothes they wear, the trousers dropping off them, which I'm told imitates the inmates of jails, because they have little fitting trousers and stuff. You know, fancy having that sector of society as your mentor or your example. It's very difficult for many white people to take these sort of people seriously, you know, as brothers and sisters in society, and so the gulf will begin to widen.
Although it is the case that some of those, obviously, young black people who take on those fashions and take on that culture, particularly hip-hop culture, they have become role models. They are very much influential.
Indeed, yes,
across the spectrum, regardless of white, black, or anything else.
It's a paradox, really. And the rappers and so on, and the big people who they all imitate, P. Diddy, and you know.
Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
Rap and so on.
Yes.
Really, yeah.
Let's look at. I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what is the worst form of racism?
I think the worst form is the insidious racism, which demoralizes and which humiliates, where you reduce an individual to nothing by ignoring him or her, as the case may be, and by belittling their efforts and achievements. And I think that although in the ghettos and in the working class areas you get stabbings and gunnings down and so on and so forth, en masse, in the nation in general, there is this insidious form of racism which is practiced, often by people who don't realize that they're doing it. They think that their behavior is perfectly honorable and so on. But it leaves no no opportunity for the underdog to really rise up above his or her circumstances. Does that make sense? I think it does.
Okay.
Where you keep people down.
Okay. In black culture, and now even I've experienced in Indian culture, it's becoming more and more common for black people or Indian people to refer to themselves as niggers and as Pakis, respectively. Now, what do you think about that? Do you think it's okay for us to use those derogatory expressions if we're just talking to ourselves?
Well, not really. I mean, quite honestly, I've always felt that black people themselves, and as you say, our Asian brothers and sisters, do tend to use these so-called derogatory comments quite freely. You know, that's my nigger. You know, and so on. All that sort of business, really. You know, almost as a term of approbation. You know. And respect. Oh, that's my nigger. I'd like to be like that nigger. But if a white person used it, then they take exception to it. It's really absurd. One term, though, I think, which should be reinstated is the term Negro. Because, I mean, if a Negro means a descendant of a slave or an African slave, then I'm happy and proud to be a Negro. You know? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
So we've looked at some of these challenges to racial harmony. Perhaps we can touch upon possible solutions. Now, the first suggestion I have for you is to ask you, what are your views on interracial marriage?
Well, my views are very positive. I think that unless or until the races confront each other in a situation of intimacy and so on, it's always going to be, you know, ships passing in the night, parallel societies that have nothing to do with, or very little to do with each other. I, of course, speak with some feeling, as my wife is white and so on, my lovely Radha. But there again, we didn't come together. I didn't set out to find a white wife or anything like that. I mean, just social circumstances did promote that. And although, as I say, it's a desirable thing in a way, I wouldn't suggest one moment for individuals to go out and look for a partner from some other race for the sake of it. I think love must evolve naturally. And if it does so multiracially, so much the better.
And carrying on along the lines of possible solutions, can you tell us about your work with the Bloomsbury International Society?
With pleasure. I think the great thing for most human beings is to be able to express themselves in as agreeable and beautiful way through music and poetry and literature and so on and so forth. And this is what the Bloomsbury Society does. It tries to use those elements to bring people together, to get them to enjoy each other and to go out into the world with a more racially harmonic intent.
And has it been successful in creating events?
Thousands of people over the last 4 decades, I should say, have benefited, and the letters and the comments we receive are most encouraging. I only hope, or my hope has always been, that there shouldn't be just one Bloomsbury International Society, but lots in each locality. There should be these organizations. Instead of talk shops with people saying, what should we do about racism and so on, get them doing things together. And the Prince's Trust, for instance, Prince Charles and his trust, I think they try to do that, and with a great deal of success too. Let us hope it becomes more universal and national, indeed international.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ian Hall, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, you've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. If you'd like to find out more, we're on the web at www.definingmoment.eu. Thank you for watching, and we wish you all the best.